We've just installed some local tools. Let's get going on using them. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at setting up clusters using Minikube and Kind. They're going to be local clusters, so don't do this in production. But we're going to take a look at those, and then we're going to use kubectl to interact with those on a very basic level. And we'll also take a look at the KubeConfig to see how they are put together by these systems, and basically how we use them and switch contexts and things like that. So let's get going. Here we are in the terminal, and the first thing we're going to do is look at Minikube and kubectl, and then we'll look at Kind. Okay, so kubectl we're going to use generally. Minikube is for deploying a cluster locally, and Kind is for deploying a cluster locally. So we'll do Minikube first. So we'll do Minikube and then --help. And we can see all of these commands here. Now, if you don't know what you're looking at, obviously this can be a bit daunting to start with. There are tutorials on the website, so I recommend having a look. I'll put the links down below. But to get started, we've got this start here, which starts a local Kubernetes cluster. Now, we can just type all these in, or we can just generate these completion commands here. So all we need to do for that is, well, run it. So let's take a look, see what we can do. We'll do Minikube completion --help. And here we can see we've got the bash, fish, and zsh options. So depending on which shell you've got, you can just tag that onto the end. And you get all of this output. All of this output basically means that we can use tab to fill things in for us. To make it so that this works, because it still won't work, just running that won't be enough. This needs to be somewhere. To make that work, all we need to do is run echo source, and then we need to do the left chevron, open and close some brackets, and then inside those brackets type Minikube completion bash, and then we need to output that into our .bash rc, or if you're using a different shell, the rc file for that one. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then do you know what, while we're here, Kind also supports this, so we'll do that. And you know what, kubectl also supports this, so let's do that as well. Now to use that, all we need to do is source the bash rc or open a new terminal. So we can go ahead and do that now, and that will work. I'm actually going to close this terminal here because that won't support it unless I run the source, but when I open a new one, it'll work. Okay, so now we've done that, we should be able to do Minikube and then start. And you can see here now, it's letting me tab to complete that, so which is really useful. So I'm going to run that, and this should default to Docker for me, but if it doesn't work, you can also put --driver equals Docker. So it actually detected the Docker installation that I've got here, but you can see here we've got other choices available. Now it's also starting up with root privileges, which is not recommended. I pre-pulled the images for this as well, so it might take a bit longer for you, but I did pre-pull them because sometimes it can take a bit of time, and I didn't want to be sat here for ages waiting for images to pull down. So that's it, we've got Minikube cluster. So let's have a look at Minikube here. We'll tab and we'll have a look at the status here. So we'll do status, and we can see here we've got a Minikube running, type control plane, and everything's up and running, it's all working. We can also check Docker desktop here, and we can see that Minikube's running. It's a single node. It has a bunch of ports that are open. You can see the images that get downloaded here, and yeah, that's all you really need to know about it. It's kind of like a cut down Kubernetes though. There you go, Minikube up and running. That's it, we can start interacting with it. And we know it works as well because we can do kubectl, and we can do config, and then we can do get contexts. And we can see here, we've got this config set up. Now a context we'll get into in just a second, but you can have multiple contexts, so you can have multiple clusters that you manage, and this is how you'd be able to see them. We can change the context with use context, and then Minikube on the end in this case, because the name of the context is all we have to reference. And there we go, switch to the context. I'll go into this once we've set up Kind because it'll make more sense. How do they work? kubectl config get contexts. Where is this information coming from? So there's a file that sits in, by default, your home directory, .cube/config. So this is a config file. And if we have a look in here, we have this YAML definition here. And this defines an API version, which everything in Kubernetes will have, so don't worry about that too much. You will learn API versions as you go through, and I'll show you how you can find out API versions. We also have this cluster section, a context section, the current context, the kind, the preference, and the users. API versions and kinds exist across the board with Kubernetes. The main thing to focus on here is the context. The context is an array of contexts, and it has a cluster, which refers to this cluster section here. So if we have a look, we've got a cluster called Minikube. So we come to clusters, find cluster and then the name Minikube. So you can see this hyphen here is an array. I'm presuming you know how to use YAML here. If you don't, I recommend going and having a look at a course on YAML because you're going to need to know it for Kubernetes. I won't be doing a course on YAML because it's pretty easy to learn, and I recommend having a quick look at it. JSON and YAML are really interchangeable in Kubernetes, and you really should know how to use both of those. Yeah, so we've got a cluster of named Kubernetes, so we can find that here. We can see here it has a certificate authority file here, extensions noted, and the server IP. So this server IP is my local host and it's Minikube essentially. And we can also see in this particular context, again, some extensions information, the namespace that it defaults to, which is default, and the user of Minikube. Well, that user Minikube refers to this pot here. So for example, I could come in here and say Minikube cluster. Now, if I write that out and then try and do this again, we can see here, it refers to a new cluster now. If I do kubectl get pod, it's going to fail because there isn't a cluster called Minikube cluster in that KubeConfig. To make that work, I would also have to name this Minikube cluster. Let's write that out. And suddenly it's working again. And now if I come down to the user, I've got this user called Minikube. We'll call Minikube user. Again, let's try. Please enter a username. Well, I haven't got a username. I've just got these certificate files. So that's not going to work. How can we fix that? Well, we come down to the user section and we rename our Minikube to Minikube user. This uses the client certificate and key to authenticate. Now, if we have a look in here, these are just a key and a public key that allow us to authenticate with Minikube. So I'm not going to get into how all this works right now because this will come much later in the harder stuff of Kubernetes. So that's where the config comes in. We can also do things like change the namespace of the context, so the default namespace. So when I run a command of kubectl get pod, for example, just as an example, there isn't any pods running in the default namespace, so it will tell me there's nothing in the default namespace. Let's say I wanted to interact by default with a different namespace, such as kubesystem. I wouldn't recommend this, but it's an example I can show you right now. What I could do is kubectl config set context minikube, so the name of the context, and then set the namespace to be kubesystem. Now if I run that same get pod command, we can see I get all the pods from the kubesystem namespace by default because it's just the namespace that it defaults to when you run a command without any sort of namespace definition. So I can reference the default namespace still by doing kubectl get pod hyphen namespace and then default. And you can see there, no resources found in the default namespace. This is how we can interact with namespaces in a different way. I'm going to go ahead and change that back to default. And just to show you for brevity, kubesystem. There we go. So we can tag the namespace onto the end of any of our commands, and we can actually shorten that as well. We don't actually need to put hyphen namespace. We can just put -n, and there we go. Same thing works. We can use kubectl help, help, sorry, for more information on commands, and this will give us a lot more. You can get more as you go into things. So for example, if I did get -help, I can then see a bunch of flags that work for this. And one of those, for example, would be all namespaces, or from a file, or changing the output format, or, you know, I mean, you can see them all here. There's quite a few. So yeah, there we go. And it gives you a few examples as well. So the help can be really useful. It tells you what's going on. It gives you a few examples. It gives you options that are available. It's really useful. I can't recommend looking at the help enough. It's really handy for doing things with kubectl. So that is something I recommend having a look through. There's obviously more on the website on how to use kubectl itself, and we'll be going through a lot more throughout this series, but I'm not going to be covering it in depth right now because this is just a quick idea of how to use the tools. So we've got Minikube, we've got a cluster set up. Now, I'm not going to go on Minikube anymore because I want to use Kind. So for using Kind, we've set up our auto completion, but let's just look at help real quick. We've got this Kind, build, completion, which we've already used, create, delete, export, get, help, load, and version. Well, looking at this, we want to create a cluster. Well, sounds like what we want. So we'll do Kind, create, and then there's a few other bits. So I know, for example, that I can specify a name. So let's have a look at help again. We can do flags and then command. Well, we can't do create flags, but we probably want to do cluster, okay? So let's do Kind create cluster. Let's do help. We're getting a little bit more now, so we can specify a config file, which if you go onto the Kind website, will give you examples of quite a bit of information in there, okay, on how it gets created. We've got kubeconfigs, names, well, name, that might be useful, so let's give it a name. So I'm going to do -n, because that's the shorthand, and I'm going to call it Kind cluster. Press enter. So it's going to create a cluster called Kind cluster. It's going to download some images, which I did not pre-populate. So we're going to have to just wait a moment while they download. And there we have it. You know, we have a single node Kind cluster. Brilliant. Now we can set the number of nodes and things like that in the config file if we wanted to set that up. For now, we don't need to worry about that, but we can check our current context again. So let's take a look at that. We have the context. Let's get them. We are automatically switched over to the Kind cluster, but we also have this Minikube here now that we were using before. It's also worth noting that Kind didn't set a default namespace. It will default to default though. If there's nothing there, it will just do default. I don't really want to continue using Minikube myself, not because I hate it or anything like that. I just personally prefer Kind. I find it easier to use in terms of emulating how a cluster would work. Because if I take a look here, kubectl get nodes, this has a single node. It's a control plane node, but I can also then add more nodes later. So for example, if I wanted to do something where I wanted multiple nodes, we would do kubectl, we would do kind, delete cluster, and Kind cluster. So I'm just going to do that. I'd then go to the Kind website. So if I take a look here, I can have a look at this link, which we go to, if you go to quick start here, we've got this configuring your Kind cluster, and we can see here this config file we were talking about before. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this. I'm going to close that window because I don't need it anymore. I'll do vim kindconfig.yaml. I'm going to paste that in and write it out. And what we can do now is I can do kind create cluster. I'll call it kind cluster again, and then I'll do config, and we will reference the kind config we just created. If I do this now, just give it a few more seconds, we'll see this time 3 containers have been created, 1 with a control plane and 2 called worker. So I can go ahead now. The control plane will be responsible for the API server pods and other things like that that are related to the cluster itself. So the API pod, the etcd, the scheduler, and other elements that are required to be on the control plane. And then the rest of it will be the worker nodes. So now when I create pods, instead of it being on a control plane node, it will go onto the worker nodes, and we can scale those worker nodes out as far as we want. I mean, we can with the control plane as well, but you don't really want to be putting Nginx, for example, on the control plane. Think of it as your admin section of the cluster. So now if I do kubectl get nodes, I've got these multiple nodes. Okay, so these will take a minute to become ready. So I'll just give that a second, and there we go. They're ready. Everything's ready. And that's Kind. So I really like Kind. I think it's much better for emulating a real cluster. That's just my opinion. People do like Minikube as well. So, you know, use what you prefer. Personally, I prefer Kind. Okay, there we go. That's it. We've got some basic clusters that we can use locally. Obviously, we won't ever use them in production because they're local tools.
This is a local shop for local people.
Anyway, so we've done that. We've set up some basic clusters that we can use locally to play with. And now we're going to take a look at setting up proper clusters, if you like, production clusters, obviously in VirtualBox, because, you know, I'm not paying Amazon or whoever for massive amounts of resources. You can if you want. I'm not going to stop you, but I won't be. So yeah, we'll get into that in the next video. We'll then look at making those clusters highly available, and then maybe take a look at pulling etcd out and using that as an external setup, or putting them externally. I'm still undecided on whether I'm going to go through that yet, because there's a few things that have changed since I originally planned to do that. So we'll see. Yeah, so I'll see you in the next one.